everyone. I'm so happy to welcome everyone to today's talk by HISB faculty fellow and music professor August Sheehy, who will present on liberal fantasies and musical forms. I'm going to tell you about a couple of upcoming attractions, and we are getting down to, I think, our last two events of the semester that will be coming up. And I'm going to turn the Zoom screen over to Judy Lockhead, who will be introducing August Sheehy. But first, in the very unlikely case that anyone here does not know Judy, let me say just a few words about her many accomplishments, achievements, and activities. Basically, Judy has chaired everything it's possible to chair at Stony Brook, or at least in the arts and humanities neighborhood. She has served 9 years as chair of the music department, not sequentially, thank God. There was a chance for her to catch her breath. She has chaired the PTC, the FOSS committee, the CAS curriculum committee, the undergraduate council, the list goes on. Not surprisingly, she was awarded the Chancellor's Award for Exceptional Faculty Service. It's really amazing all that Judy has done. She's currently the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and the Title IX Deputy in CAS. She still finds time to have a very active publishing career. Her book, Reconceiving Structure in Contemporary Music, was published in 2015, and she has co-edited 3 volumes. The most recent will be forthcoming from the University of Chicago in April 2021. It's titled Sound and Affect, Voice, Music, World. And when not running the university or writing a book, Judy also plays clarinet with the contemporary chamber players at Stony Brook. So Judy, I will turn the Zoom screen over to you.
Thank you very much. I guess people can hear me, right? So thank you, Susan. That was unexpected, and I appreciate all that stuff. I'm feeling kind of tired after you said all that. So anyway, my primary job here is to introduce August Sheehy, my colleague, who we've been working quite closely together over the past few years, and so it gives me great pleasure to introduce him in this context. So he's currently assistant professor in the music history and theory program in the music department, and he teaches courses on music analysis, music theory, and the history of music theory. And some of his talk today is going to be focused on the research that he does and is involved in doing right now. So this research examines the relationship between music analysis and history with a focus on German-speaking Europe between the French Revolution and World War II. August investigates both the ways music theory and analysis connect musical experience to other domains of knowledge, such as politics and law, religion and theology, philosophy and psychology, art and culture, and also the personal, political, and social effects of making such connections. His work has been richly supported by a DAAD grant and a Charlotte Newcomb Fellowship, the American Musicological Society, and of course, the Humanities Institute here at Stony Brook. And the talk that he's giving today is part of his In Progress monograph, which is titled Sonata Politics. And as I said, the title, as Susan said, the title is Liberal Fantasies, Musical Forms. And I will also say, I'm going to turn it over to August now. I will also say that what we're going to do is we will ask you to put any questions that you might have in the chat. And you may put questions as they arise to you during August's talk, or you can wait until afterward and we'll be taking questions from the chat, okay? So just keep that in mind as you're listening, and now it gives me great pleasure to turn it over to August.
Hi everyone. First of all, thank you. It's lovely to see so many faces and names. And I just thank you for taking the time to join us today. I know everyone is busy, everyone is exhausted, so it means a lot to see all of you here. I'd also like to thank quickly Judy for that lovely introduction, and Susan, colleagues in music department and at the Humanities Institute, especially Adrian Perez Melgosa and Adrian Unger, for helping me feel so welcomed and so supported as a faculty fellow. So it is exciting to be here, even if here isn't exactly what I'd imagined it would be when I first learned I'd be giving this talk. So I'd like to begin in this present moment and talk a little bit about the ways in which my research that I'm going to be presenting has been shaped or reshaped by recent events, and suggest what I think or what I hope this kind of work might have to offer. And then from there, I'm going to dig into one of the central arguments from my book about the role of fantasy in shaping one of the main threads in the history of modern music theory. So first thing, obviously, the ongoing pandemic. I've been fortunate to the extent that I've been able to continue my research, my project, though it's involved slight adjustments of proportions, a little less documentary and archival work than I might have done with, say, another trip to Germany, somewhat more development of the historiographic and ethical implications of the work that I've already done in its place. That might have been the case, even if safe travel were possible. The prolonged sense of uncertainty and political crisis of the past several years has nurtured a need to wring meaning from what could easily be a fairly niche pursuit, even by academic standards. That is, the history of a concept that matters primarily within the subdiscipline of music theory, a discipline often regarded by non-initiates as forbiddingly technical or worse. So with respect for the non-music scholars who are here and gratitude, I will try to avoid or explain any kind of technical music theoretical terms as I go. The other context and recontextualization of this work has to do with social upheavals, protests, renewed calls for social justice, particularly in the face of racism that reaches into every facet of American history and life. So, the violence, mortal violence directed at Black individuals like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony Dade, countless others, is, as we know, only the most visible feature of a systemic problem that affects literally everything: environment, legislation, public discourse, media representations, on and on and on. And as we all know, it also bears on scholarship in the humanities, and music theory is no exception. A lot of people in the field have long recognized that representation is a problem. People like Judy Lochhead, both in a demographic sense and in the sense that the primary object of study has been the canonical, classical music of Western Europe and its offshoots. But the events of the past few years, extraordinary efforts of activists and organizers, Black Lives Matter, public intellectuals like Ibram X. Kendi, Crystal Fleming here at Stony Brook, have made the systemic nature of racism impossible to ignore, even for the most traditionally minded of music theorists or historians of music theory, while also raising the hope that it can finally be addressed. And a sign of the time from within music theory, as many of you will know, was Philip Ewell's keynote address at the National Conference of the Society for Music Theory last year in Columbus, Ohio, in which he explained and documented music theory's white racial frame. And the fallout from that, which was slow at first and then kind of all at once, became arguably the most high-profile dust-up in the profession's history when it was picked up by Fox News and other conservative media outlets as the liberal scandal du jour. The upshot has been a groundswell of collective effort in the discipline to root out the ways in which music theoretical knowledge has worked to privilege whiteness, maleness, able-bodiedness, and so on. Needless to say, it's collective work in progress. And I bring all this up because I found myself, working on the project, a book about an idea that is at the very heart of what some have described as white music theory. Namely, I've been working on how the discipline of music theory came to be, first of all, enamored with theorizing musical forms, and secondly, how Viennese musical classicism circa 1800 was installed at the center of that effort by making, for example, sonata form the pinnacle of artistic achievement in the Western classical tradition. And within music historiography, one can sort of put this centeredness crudely by saying what came before it is designated as early music, and what has come after it is designated as new music. Virtually all of it, though, is from this coming from this European center. So the central figure in my work in this project is Adolf Bernhard Marx. And here I realize I should be in my slideshow. Can everyone see that? Okay, good. So Adolf Bernhard Marx, 19th century German music theorist, who developed his influential ideas through engagement with the music of the most canonical European composers: Johann Sebastian Bach, Willibald Christoph Gluck, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and the so-called hero of Western music, Beethoven. This is the music that shaped his theory, and Marx's work is generally acknowledged as a or even the decisive contribution toward modern music theory's fascination with musical form. That is to say, the European classical forms taught today in conservatories and universities in Europe and America, and indeed all around the world in conservatories modeled on those institutions. So these are forms like song forms, art song forms, binary and ternary dance forms, rondos, and of course, sonata form pieces. Put another way, Marx made form as such a problem for modern music theory. He was, we could say, an author in Michel Foucault's sense. But a glance at post-structuralism isn't going to theorize the problematization I've been talking about away. As you can see, even looking at this slide, the project does not look like the path to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, I had been approaching this history critically, at least in the sense that I didn't aim to valorize Marx for being the first writer to theorize sonata form, or for that matter, Beethoven for being the composer whose music necessitated such a theory. I wanted to understand in a fine-grained way, in a material way, why this particular individual theorized music in the specific way that he did, independently, insofar as I could manage it, from the subsequent influence that theory has exercised on the discipline. My starting point for doing that was the one with which Marx begins his own biographical narrative. His memoirs from 1865 begin with the sentence, "I am the son of a doctor, born May 15th in Halle an der Saale, in the bosom of the Israelite community." Given the political marginalization of Jews in 19th century Prussia, and their two steps forward, one step back procession towards full legal, if not actual, equality with German unification in 1871, just 5 years after Marx's death, I'd imagined that Marx's Jewish origins might complicate critiques that the discipline of music theory was and had always been on the side of political conservatism. Or put another way, that any simplistic narrative of music theory, or that music theory was developed to protect existing hierarchies of power based on differences such as race, gender, etc., was in fact simplistic. What I found, or what I have found, is complicated, to be sure. It's a story richer in twists and turns than I could have imagined, or than I will be able to untangle today. But it's certainly not a panacea to the problems I've been talking about. Music theory won't be absolved of its complicity in unjust structures of power by continuing to focus on European music and musical thought. And I'm not, as I said, alone in saying this. But I have become convinced that historical work in music theoretical thought can be an important part of the strategies for bending the discipline toward ethical ends. And I just want to mention 3 ways that I think this is the case. The first is identity. So my work on Marx, I'll be talking about, develops a historical argument about how tightly music theoretical ideas are linked with one's identity within a social matrix. Such matrices provide, for example, the metaphors on which music theory necessarily draws. The deployment of those metaphors can then shift the theorist's place within the network of social relations. Put another way, theories of music operate within and constitute individuals' creative responses to social worlds. Which means they are also encounters. But the second point, encounter, I mean in still a broader sense. Recent work by other historians of theory, Andrew Hicks, Thomas Christensen, Qingfang Jiang, Lester Hu, for example, show that Western music theory has never been the pure cultural expression implied by that term, Western. Indeed, the word itself, or the idea of Western music, is the product of cross-cultural encounters. So even deep-rooted theoretical traditions, things like Pythagoreanism, the idea of equal temperament on which keyboards are based, and tonality, were products of encounters with other cultures: Persian, Arabian, Chinese, African, and so on. Marx's writings come from within Europe, but they bear out Israeli scholar Ran Cohen's suggestion that a, quote, post-colonial perspective would view 19th century Jews in Germany as a sort of colony within Germany. And Marx's theory of form, the elevation of sonata form as a concept, can thus be understood partly as a product of the encounter between Jewishness as an orientalized otherness and the dominant Christian German culture in which he lived. It can therefore also be understood as a form of political discourse. And this is my third point. To cast music theory in terms of a confrontation between self and other in 19th century Germany is inevitably to recall Hegel. All the more so in the case of Marx, because he moved to Berlin at the height of Hegel's fame. And I'm not going to focus on that today, but it's worth mentioning, in part because virtually all previous scholarship on Marx does link him in some way to the philosopher. Most notable recently, for example, is Janet Schmalfeld's book, In the Process of Becoming, where she credits Marx with making the most decisive contributions to linking Beethoven's music and Hegel's philosophy. And Patrick Uribe, in his 2011 dissertation, reads Marx and Hegel both as products of this particular time in which everyone is concerned with concepts of freedom. What interests me is in the context of Marx's Jewish identity and the encounter of that identity with the dominant culture, freedom has more than just philosophical resonances. And so I want to keep that in mind. One might wonder why any of this is new or why it took so long to think about music theory in these ways. And generally, it's because theory has been framed as an apolitical form of knowledge. And that's true to a certain extent of Marx's own work. His best-known work of music theory, his Lehre von der musikalischen Komposition, or Treatise on Musical Composition, published in 4 volumes between 1837 and 47, seems to bear that out. He doesn't talk about politics. He just seems to write about music. But as Philip Bohlman pointed out almost 3 decades ago, the denial of the political is itself a powerful political strategy. And the writer who lacks political power is arguably most advantaged by declining to get involved in the status quo political discourse. And that's certainly true for at least some Prussian Jews in the first half of the 19th century, whose motives for seeking political equality were always under suspicion. Now, there is an irony that this means that I'm reading texts by Marx somewhat suspiciously, between the lines, as it were, but not to the point, I hope, of straining credulity. Not, for example, when he writes in defense of his own musical thought and music pedagogy that he is, for example, quote, concerned with nothing other nor less than the conflict that engages our era, the struggle of free understanding against dogma, of irrepressible progress against standstill and stagnation. This conflict is being fought on all sides and in all forms, in politics as in theology, in the sciences and arts as in the foundation of all culture, Bildung, and the pedagogical and educational system. Everywhere, it's a matter of the spirit becoming free. And this emphasis on freedom is a recurring motif in Marx, as is the idea of Bildung, the idea of self-cultivation that underpinned meritocratic ideology, particularly attractive to Jews who were told since the late 18th century by, for example, progressive Christians that they weren't bad people, but that centuries of oppression had rendered them unfit for the rigors of full civic participation. So the idea of elevating oneself to be worthy of that was part of that ideology. And I'd just add that this is a fundamentally liberal idea too. The emphasis on freedom, the idea of individual freedom being the best grounding for political relations. But for Marx, as for so many today, that freedom, if it came at all, came at the cost of assimilation. So just want to say one thing as I now move into some of the more specific parts of my research. In this talk, I will quote at one point from a very anti-Jewish primary source document. I'll let you know when I'm about to do it in case you'd rather not see or hear it. So Marx's Lehre von der musikalischen Komposition presented a new conception of musical form. Not just an account of how to compose musical forms, such as a da capo aria or a minuet and trio, nor a description of what usually happens in particular types of pieces. Rather, he was offering an explanation of the immanent relations between forms. And the way that Marx began that was to argue that music develops from a single, simple principle of rest, motion, rest. First manifested in the simplest of ideas, even something like 2 notes, ba-dum, right? you go from one, you go to the other, it implies a kind of motion, ba-da-dum, back to where you started. For Marx, that was enough to imply this from a place of rest, moving away and back to it. And from that, he developed an idea of phrases, melodies that were either syntactically closed, they came to a full rest at the end, which he called singular Satz or plural Sätze, or phrases that were open-ended and required a kind of continuation. And those phrases he called a gang or Gänge. The same principle was then recursively applied to yield a kind of generation of ever more increasingly complex forms. So he begins with song forms, simple three-part forms, and then he moves from simple rondos through more complex rondos, sonatina, and then finally and famously sonata form. And this mess of letters you see on your screen is mostly to show the kind of growth of ideas. The different abbreviation here standing for main Satz, or the main musical idea, the secondary Satz, secondary idea, the gong, and then a closing kind of idea. And I'm just going to focus here on the last part, on sonata form, for anyone who is not familiar with this idea, and give a quick overview of what that is. Sonata form, after Marx's theorization of it, was regarded as having three parts, which came to be called exposition, development, and recapitulation, although those were not Marxist terms. He just called them the first part, the second part, and the third part. The general shape of sonata form was that it had two themes, or in Marx's case, two Sätze, one in a key, which would be often named in the title of the piece, a sonata in B flat or something, and the second, which would be in another key. So that kind of motion away from the sort of home base. That would then set up a kind of tension that was worked out in the middle section in development, where the musical ideas and themes are treated in various ways, taken through different keys, broken up into smaller sections, played against one another, that kind of thing. And this is often metaphorically staged as a kind of conflict, an idea that continues to resonate even in seemingly more neutral metaphors, sometimes used in music theory, like the section is a tour of keys. I'm thinking, tour also has a kind of martial metaphorical resonance. The third section, then, the recapitulation, was the reconciliation of the two themes into the same key, sort of the resolution of that large conflict engendered by the form. And this form has been the subject of many, many, many articles, monographs, theoretical treatises. It has been critiqued for the sort of hierarchical conception, for example, by Susan McClary, who makes Marx a kind of villain for having characterized the first theme as masculine and the second as feminine, and argues that baked into the whole form is a kind of heteropatriarchal ideology. Nevertheless, sonata form remains the apogee of classical form. William Kaplan, for instance, sums up a lot of the discourse when he writes, "Many historians and theorists consider it to be the period's most highly developed and complex compositional design, the one in which composers reveal their greatest technical skill and expressive potential." All right, so this is the centering of this idea within nearly 200 years of music theoretical discourse. So this sketch, very sketchy sketch that I just presented of Marx's theory, though familiar to music scholars, is actually incomplete. And not only because it condenses 1,200 pages of exposition into a few sentences. It actually omits Marx's conclusion, in which sonata form, his theorization of it, gives way to a consideration of what he calls mixed and compound forms. And over the course of about 30 more pages, he gives examples of what he means by showing that musical elements such as key, tempo, meter, the number of movements that a multi-movement work has, become more unfixed and variable. And then he launches into his peroration. He says, everywhere, starting from a basic form as the kernel of an entire realm of forms, we have found a series of forms which, for various reasons, sought to become more and more detached from that basic form, to emancipate themselves. A few sentences later, he adds, by recognizing that it is possible and permissible to abandon every fixed form, to give it the freedom of our spirit, which recognizes no law other than itself, hereby the whole Formenlehre is led to its goal. In it and with it and through it, we have become free. And then finally, he writes, the designs now, that is musical designs, in which this last step to freedom is taken, we gather together with the name fantasy. So fantasy for Marx names the goal of the Formenlehre. And this has been, as I said, ignored and sometimes even actively suppressed. Scott Burnham, in an early article, wrote, yeah, Marx, he says that, but really, no, it's sonata form. That's the telos of the whole theory. But fantasy is where it ends, literally, in his book. And in an important respect, fantasy, that is musical fantasies, which is a genre, is like the forms that precede it. Just as there are song forms and rondos distinguished by certain musical characteristics, so there are fantasies. And there's scholarship on these features, Catherine Coppola's 1998 dissertation, Annette Richards' work on fantasy, and so on. But as the goal of the theory, as its teleological goal, fantasy cannot be analogous to the others. It's a limit case beyond which there can be no other more advanced forms. And so it's a paradox, a form that Marx himself wrote can have no fixed form. So we might say fantasy is free form, but not free of form. It thus has the appearance of something embarrassing in the reception of Marx's ideas, something perhaps beyond Formenlehre, some other discourse, or the discourse of some other. So one can ask, what was Marx's fantasy? And you may anticipate where I'm going with that question. There is, of course, a discourse that has centered fantasy and otherness. Indeed, one that's founded in part on investigating fantasies, uncovering their premises, analyzing them, traversing them, and revealing why they might embarrass us. I'm thinking, of course, of psychoanalysis. And I take a cue here from Seth Brodsky's argument that musical fantasy and psychoanalytic fantasy may not be so far removed from one another. Both are taken as intimate expressions of selfhood. And at the same time, the source of that intimacy, its raw materials, remain beyond the veil of consciousness. Fantasy concerns occluded origins. So my wager is that uncovering Marx's fantasy is critical to understanding the origins of his theory, and in turn, by extension, the origin of disciplinary practices today. What I want to suggest is that the form of fantasy in Marx's work is also a fantasy of form. That is, a fantasy about what musical form and the teaching of form, or theories of form, Formenlehre, can do. That is, to say how such an idea fits into Marx's perception of the conflict he speaks of, that engaged his era on all sides. Fantasy named not only a musical genre marked by its difference from fixed forms, but also a desire that prompted and produced Marx's theoretical discourse. And desire here names not simply self-conscious wants, that is the content of fantasy in an everyday sense, but that which makes wanting possible, the unconscious fantasy likened by Brodsky to the stage on which desires are performed. From this perspective, Marx's fantasy would not be only the self-conscious, composerly artistic freedom highlighted in his Lehre and promised to its assiduous student, but an unconscious fantasy driving his desire to involve himself with music in the first place. What makes it fantasy, however, is not only its occlusion, but the structural impossibility of its realization. And we have to begin here, of course, with Marx's own words. Marx cited 7 examples of musical fantasy in his treatise, which I've listed here. 2 Beethoven piano sonatas, a pair of late works in F minor by Mozart, both from Mechanical Clock, but known to Marx in piano 4-hand arrangements. Mozart Fantasies in C major and C minor for piano, and Johann Sebastian Bach's Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue in D minor. What's interesting here is that the first 4 of these are not obviously fantasies in a generic sense. That is to say, among other things, they lack many of the markers of the genre as understood today, and they also can be explained without adding anything or without adding much to what Marx had already written about form earlier in his book. So as my example here, I'm going to focus in on the Beethoven piano sonata in E flat major, opus 27, number 1, which will serve to show how this music exemplifies Marx's ideas. Starting with, as I said, this simple idea of rest, motion, rest, which is realized at different temporal spans nested within one another. So I'll put up the score here for those who find it helpful, but I just want to listen to the opening few notes, the part outlined in orange. I want you to note that this idea here, we'll see, it permeates the whole movement. So this recording is the pianist Paul Lewis. Even that tiny bit of music embodies this idea of Marx's rest, motion, rest, primarily in the rhythm, in the relative stillness of the opening chords, gives way to this running note played by the pianist's left hand, and then back. So, bum, bum, ba da 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 da, bum, bum, right? Just that rhythm is that idea. At a slightly larger time span, a harmonic shift from tonic harmony, the home bass harmony, away from it to the dominant harmony and back to tonic in the first 3 measures, again manifests a kind of rest, motion, rest concept. And I'll play this and I'll kind of sing, not too obnoxiously, I hope, a kind of through line that you can really hear this change in harmony. So. Right, away and back. At the same time, the repetition of that motive, the bum, 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 right, sets up an expectation that one is going to hear that motive again. And of course, that is what happens. This is the logic. I'm kind of rehearsing this to give you a sense of the logic of Marx's musical, theoretical, aesthetic thinking. Each kind of manifestation of this idea is incomplete in some sense and necessitates a continuation to add more music. So it's a kind of, on the one hand, an aesthetic problem is solved, at the same time, another one is created and creates the need for ever longer spans of music. In this movement, these rhythmic and harmonic ideas keep telescoping outwards, and eventually creating the whole movement that's fairly well described by Marx's second rondo form, which is what I have at the top of the screen. So the music for these first 8 measures here is what I'm calling the main Satz, and the next 2 measures here, I'll play it, condense both that rhythmic idea and the harmonic movement into a single 2 measures that closes more satisfactorily at the end. So you can see I've labeled it on the right a Satz, and just listen to that. Right, so it closes nicely. And this is his idea of a closed phrase, a Satz. It's opened up again in the next phrase by, again, another shift in harmony away from E flat and a return to it, coming to rest in the home key once again. Motion. Right, so this dynamic, simple as it is a useful analytical lens, and Marx used it to build this whole system. The next section of the piece, then, it's a similar idea. It's another 8 measures of music, but it goes further away from the initial E flat by introducing harmony that isn't in the key at all in the second 4 measures, the C major. And I'm not going to belabor this, merely to point out that it too conforms to Marx's conception of Satz, these closed phrases. Okay, and then lastly, an example of a gong. There's an open-ended kind of phrase, this next section of the work. And this is all motion. If you think of the shape of the overall work as that first part, everything we've heard up to now being restful in a large-scale sense, this section is the motion part. The tempo changes, the meter changes, the dynamic becomes loud, there are pounding chords in the left hand accompanying it. Everything here is motion. But it never concludes in E flat as it should. And so it creates a need to continue. And just listen to this. Back to the restful music at the beginning. So I've belabored this point somewhat to show 2 things. First of all, that Marxist theory is a useful frame for analyzing music in a fairly intuitive way. 2, that this movement does not musically require some new category for him to explain, i.e. fantasy. At every turn, motive, phrase, section, large-scale structure, it illustrates his rest, motion, rest idea, and it fits into his conception of closed and open phrases, and indeed conforms to one of the large-scale forms that he has explicitly identified. So it takes an act of will, or one might say desire, I think, to hear this music that we've just been listening to in Marx's words as, quote, the abandonment of every fixed form. So what's interesting about this is it collapses fantasy back into the theory of form. That's how he closes off his theory so that there can be no further forms, sort of twisting it back in. But this in turn puts a twist on the idea of fantasy as freedom. It becomes, as Marx himself put it, not the supposed, quote, the supposed freedom of the uneducated, the ungebildet, who in his poverty and limitedness thinks he is free, but rather the secure freedom of those who know all the directions and ways and can thus exchange them and can go anywhere without going astray. The fantasy of freedom, then, consists of a return to and a mastery of codes, of not going astray, not making errors when someone is listening. Put another way, freedom under scrutiny, observation, analysis, and perhaps suspicion may not turn out to be much freedom, in which case Marx's fantasy turns out to be just that, an imaginary scenario. Or, as Freud would put it several decades later, the fulfillment of a wish, a correction of an unsatisfying reality. So much for musical fantasy, then. What was Marx's reality? Let's go back to his memoirs. I'm the son of a doctor, born May 15th in Halle an der Saale, in the bosom of the Israelite community. That was the date, at least, inscribed in synagogue records, according to Marx. The date recorded in his family Bible was November 28th, 1799. But he wrote, "It doesn't matter. My father remained strictly and adamantly a member of the Jewish community, without the slightest inclination to the old church. He was essentially neither Jew nor Christian, but a follower of Voltaire." The struggle to reconcile these two themes of the culture in which he found himself, then, is literally on the first page of Marx's life story. He himself would convert to Lutheranism sometime around 1816 or 17, a fact that he then hastens to explain in the first chapter of his memoirs. "I cannot deny," he wrote, "that what led me to Christianity and drew me ever more to it was not so much the theological doctrine. Rather," he explained, "Mozart's Requiem and Handel's Messiah compelled him to study the biblical texts, at which point he came to recognize, quote, the poetic dignity and profound wisdom of the Book of Books." Now, scholars have generally taken Marx at face value. That is to say, they take this as an account, both as a true account of his conversion and the sincerity of his newfound Christian convictions. But that wasn't the reality. In fact, Marx had chosen not the precarious life of the musician, but rather to pursue a legal career, beginning with university studies in Halle. In 1815, on schedule to complete his studies, he applied for a clerkship at the regional court, the Land- und Staatsgericht in Berlin. And this is the letter of application that you can see here. And a couple of things about this that are noteworthy. The letter foregrounds Marx's Jewishness in virtually the same terms as his memoirs. He's introduced immediately as a Jewish co-religionist, and perhaps to establish some kind of stature, social status, the son of a doctor of medicine. The letter goes on to cite the statutes from the Jewish Emancipation Edict of 1812 to show that Marx was allowed to hold this position. Specifically, it cites the 8th statute, which stated that Jews could, quote, administer municipal offices for which they have qualified themselves. And secondly, it cites the 9th statute, which more ambivalently says, as far as the admission of Jews to other public services, we leave to ourselves its regulation to law in the course of time. The decisions, in other words, were left to powerful bureaucrats. And that brings me to the angry scrawl in the left margin of this letter, and to the content warning I mentioned earlier. These words are baldly anti-Semitic, or to use the term of Marx's time, they are laden with Judenhass, literally hatred for Jews. But I think it's important, and the reason I want to quote it, it's important to understand what Marx experienced if we want to understand his thinking. So the petition was denied without question because the Jews are absolutely incapable of justice and the exclusion from all state offices is expressed clearly enough. This was Marx's reality, and he would soon convert to Lutheranism after this rejection. Following conversion, he was appointed to a clerkship in the small town of Naumburg, from which all Jews had been exiled in 1494. And though they had started to return annually for a fair, the policy of excluding them was reaffirmed in 1804, just a little over a decade before Marx very unhappily resided there. A few years later, he moved to Berlin, where he sought work at the Supreme Court, with limited success, though he was supported by its one Jewish-born jurist, Julius Hitzig. The rest is among musicologists fairly well-known history. Marx became the editor of a successful journal, the Berliner Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, published by another Jewish convert, Adolf Schlesinger. And his success as a music critic led him to circles where he struck up a friendship famously with Felix Mendelssohn, another convert, and also led in 1830 to an appointment at the University of Berlin, where he wrote his Lehre, and where the colleague he most admired, a man named Eduard Ganz, had been the president of the Society for the Culture and Science of the Jews, which had led a movement for full Jewish participation in Prussian government based on Hegelian philosophy, but which ultimately failed. I stress these social relations because they comport with historian David Sorkin's argument that even successful assimilationists to German culture remained a subculture apart. And Sorkin argues that this community remained largely invisible even to itself. In this sense, they embodied a collective fantasy of integration and assimilation. Musicologist David Conway writes that, quote, reconciling two worlds could be for the Jew of the early 19th century and afterwards an unrelenting task. And it was a task under suspicion. A Jew, writes Conway, had to, quote, perceive not only his or her performance as a member of society, but also to absorb the perceptions of the audience of this performance, who experienced it knowing that it was being given by a Jew, end quote. Constrained by the double bind of either being too Jewish or not Jewish enough, the convert was forever proving himself. And this helps explain, I think, Marx's conversion narrative. Lived experience taught him not to be open, to say that he needed it for employment, but rather better to tell a convincing story supported by the manifest reality of his commitment to music. And it also helps explain, critically for my argument, why Marx theorized music in the way he did, as an assimilation of themes into ever grander structures. When Marx described the essence of higher forms of music, that is, rondos, sonatas, and ultimately fantasies, he characterized them with two features. First, two or more independent wholes should, second, be formally joined in a higher whole. This is, I submit, not garden variety organicism, if such a thing exists. Marx was acting, I would argue, as what Caroline Levine calls a canny formalist, using a discourse of form to effect or instill broader change through music pedagogy. Or perhaps he was an uncanny theorist, reveling in a sublimated discourse of assimilation, one whose truth speaks in spite of itself, between the lines, and in words never quite its own, and which a later Jewish believer in and advocate for Bildung in Vienna would use to found another discipline of listening. In closing, I'd like to stress that music was more than a metaphor for Marx. It was his primary medium of Bildung, that ideology promoted by Jewish German assimilationists and many Christian advocates for Jewish civil rights. Music did show that Marx was gebildet. It afforded him a career as a critic and then as a university professor, but at the cost of his Jewish identity within a utilitarian profession of Christian faith and the confines of a newly disciplined music theory. A music theory that would henceforth itself fantasize that theories of form could be separated from the hidden desires that compel its articulation. And so we see all around us today still the pernicious effects of a kind of liberal philosophy, the distortion of that term's meaning in American political discourse notwithstanding. We can also see that it's a powerful and enduring fantasy, the bootstrap mentality, meritocracy, freedom of the individual. Nevertheless, there's an irony here that a major strain of musical thought developed not in the mind of someone hoping to oppress, but to liberate. And I think here again of new formalists such as Caroline Levine and Anna Kornbluh, who suggest that a commitment to the formation of new communities and coalitions and of their strategic deployment. This goes far beyond my talk today, but I'll close by simply wondering what musical forms await those who reject the assimilationist fantasy and to what ends, musical and social, they might be wielded. Thank you very much for listening.
So just a reminder that we're going to take questions through the chat. So please, if you have a question or a comment, please put it there and we'll proceed. I see some people writing, so that's good.
This is what we didn't think of. Typing takes longer than
the typing
speaking.
takes longer than speaking. All right, we're a little time to put things together. I was going to ask a question, but I have to write it down. So.
Oh, what? Yeah. So Stephen Kahn has asked about my thoughts on Marx as a composer, and the oratorio Mose. It's a good question, and I think I think of Jeff Spossato's work, suggesting that Marx was trying to find a middle ground, in contrast to Mendelssohn, kind of going out of his way not to depict Jews as any less than Christians, and of course it was a the story of Moses was a popular theme, but his take on it is it seems to, I'll just simply say that it seems to be, in as much as I've gone into it, of a piece with what I'm saying, and that that it's not the most exciting music. He's an adventurous theorist, but a less exciting and adventurous composer. It was performed by Liszt, which I think was probably the most, as a conductor, probably the most high-profile performance it got. But Mendelssohn infamously refused to perform it. It's a great question, and I need to think about it more. Ryan. So Ryan wrote, wondering if you'd like to expand any more on Marx's relationship to Mendelssohn Bartholdy and the kind of anti-Semitism that he experienced his whole career. Do I see that as playing a role in how Marx navigated the identity in a similar context? Yeah. So, I think there's not too much else to say. Sposato suggests that in fact one of the contributing factors to the dissolution of the friendship between Marx and Mendelssohn may have been their differing views on this topic. And I find that speculative as it is, convincing as far as it goes. I mean, we know from Teresa Marx, her memoir, that when the friendship ended disastrously and spectacularly, that Marx went into the Tiergarten and threw all Mendelssohn's letters in the river. And so we don't have these documents that would tell us a lot about what they thought about all kinds of things. Okay. So Ilan is typed here. In Marx's case, assimilation took the form of conversion to Lutheranism, though at the same time or shortly thereafter, Western Europe witnessed movements in Jewish communities that resulted in the organization of the Reform Jewish tradition, which retained Jewish tradition while still assimilating to the larger secular culture. I wonder if there's a distinctive character in Marx's fantasy as a convert versus that of assimilation that resulted in a turn towards a more secular Jewish tradition. Yeah, Meyerbeer is part of that, as were the whole group of the membership of the society I mentioned for the science and cultures, Wissenschaft und Kultur der Juden, that was led by Edward Gans, of which Heine was briefly a member. Meyerbeer grew up in this, and of course there were these secular gatherings, right, in at the Mendelssohn's house, for example, and I think this turn to a kind of secularism and secularism as a kind of salve for the differences between that, something that would save them, of course, that would salvage good relations. And this is bound up as well with liberalism, which is at the heart of the argument here as well. I'd love to talk with you more about it, Ilan. Because I think this was cut every which way within the Reformed tradition. For example, starting to hold services in German, but I don't know, and I'm not knowledgeable enough to know if there was a consistency right between the early Reform and non-Reform traditions, or if there's more of a continuum of practices as it developed. Anyone who knows, would love to talk about it. Yeah. Any other questions?
Here's mine.
Thanks, Judy. The music is sometimes thought of as outside of the political or social. And I know that your larger goal is to show how music, in its very sounding, is political in deep ways. But did music provide a way for Marx to get outside the political, given the time in which he was writing? I think yes and no. I think that is at the heart of the fantasy I'm trying to describe, that through music he could locate himself outside of it, but then it becomes a kind of sort of sublimated discourse, that he's saying that there is a kind of unconscious set of relations behind the way that he thinks about music, that it becomes a way of saying, the way of espousing a political philosophy that not only might carry more weight when put in aesthetic terms, coming from him, but also might ultimately be more effective. And this is the kind of twist that I mentioned, right? Is that it was very effective. It was too effective, right? That music, by removing it from politics, right, it became common knowledge that music was transcendent, that it was separate from the political. And that sort of twist that now we find, for decades now, right, that musicology has found itself trying to recover from this denial that music could be anything but music. But that said, music certainly afforded him a kind of mobility. Clearly, he was deathly afraid of being poor, which is why he chose to go into law rather than music, and to end up a professor at the prestigious modern University of Berlin with colleagues. To be able to call Hegel and Schelling and August Bach and all of these luminaries in many fields, his colleagues. He was in awe of that himself. He writes in his memoirs. He just lists. He's like, I can't believe these people are my colleagues. So, yeah, clearly it did allow him something. And whatever kind of misgivings there are, they're always sort of between the lines. And there are there are hints of it, like when he describes himself as a pearly, dark-haired child with an overactive Eastern imagination, right? That there's this that does tap into these anti-Jewish discourses in very subtle ways. That one's maybe not as subtle as others, but even the choice to use, the term Israelite rather than Jewish was very much a choice of positioning oneself in the spectrum of possibilities. Steve has a question. Given the comparison scholars have made between A.B. Marx and Hegel, would fantasy as the culminating form in Marx's Formenlehre be analogous to absolute knowledge in Hegel? If so, it seems striking that the scholarly community that compares the two so often, as you lay out, then goes on to discuss Marx's version of fantasy so little, if I'm understanding you correctly. Within music theory, I think it'd be overstating things or hyping them up a little too much to say the debate rages on. But the question of Marx and Hegel has been fraught for a long time and has been sliced every which way, that he was just hopping on the Hegel bandwagon but didn't really know what he was talking about, to he had thoroughly and correctly absorbed Hegelian ideas, but nobody knows from where, to, there was some Hegel in there, but also Goethe's plant metamorphosis, right? And all, and a lot of it is speculative and hermeneutic, because the evidence it's just not there that he'd ever read Hegel closely. What I think is interesting in my project, and didn't get into it today, is tracing some of the social networks, like where he probably got his Hegel from was from the man he describes as his eternal friend, and who mentions more than any other colleague, Edward Gantz, who had gone through the same, even worse pressure to convert and eventually succumb to it. Like I said, his efforts to use Hegel as a kind of intellectual linchpin to convince authorities that Jews should be equal participants in the Prussian government failed. And Marx says repeatedly that he's deeply skeptical of philosophy as ever being able to really say anything meaningful about music. And that he says Hegel didn't know what he was talking about in the aesthetics even. When Marx does turn to Hegel, or at least Hegelian rhetoric more explicitly, is much later in his career in the 40s and 50s, and he says some things at that point that really start to sound Hegelian. And I think he embraces it because someone else, Edward Kruger, as you know, Steve, aesthetician, philosopher, who saw Marx's theory as a sort of Hegelian philosophy of music and promoted it in that way. And then Marx kind of, I think, says, oh, okay, now it's acceptable to bring Hegel back in. So there's a lot there. I don't think I answered your question, but again, would love to talk about it because I know you've spent so much time on the Hegelian side of things. Susan, you suggest that Marx's idea of fantasy as an imagined possibility of freedom by those who have mastered the forms has not been the part of his work that music theorists have paid the most attention to, but do you see the legacy of this idea persisting and exerting influence beyond the dominant community of music theorists, scholars, among musicians, for example? I mean, absolutely. Yes. It's one of the funny things when I spoke about Marx, for reasons that are explainable in terms of his biography and local context, taking the politics out of his music and being too successful, that even ideas about music transcending differences, about it being universal. Now, these aren't ideas that can be placed all on Marx. He's one small thread in many people in kind of German romanticism leading to that conclusion. But he gives it a kind of theoretical cachet that I think is that's often too quickly dismissed as organicism, right? As aesthetic organicism, or the idea of wholeness that has been so critiqued and maligned as as necessarily oppressive, right? That aesthetic wholes, any kind of whole, necessarily excludes what it doesn't include. But I think the idea of music as kind of a perfectly, how to put it, a perfect whole that doesn't need, it doesn't need words. It doesn't need interference from anyone to be perfect, to be what it is. I think is something that maybe not in those words, but is a pretty widely held and cherished kind of belief that it is this domain that we can put aside and, I don't want to think about, X. I'm going to put on some music and just, let it wash over me. And there's nothing. That's not to say that's a bad use of music or anything, but I think a lot of that is part of this legacy. And I guess I would I would add to that too. This is something that I think about a lot teaching music theory and analysis to performers among musicians, as you say, who can sometimes really take to it, and other times, feel kind of resistant to cracking it open, and I can empathize with that too. That not there's a lot in this this history, this story that isn't comforting. So. Yeah, Judy just asked, thinking about now, what kinds, if any, of music theory is being produced about music nowadays? How would I compare what's going on now in comparison to Marx? One thing that I find absolutely staggering is the amount of energy that is still being poured into theorizing this Viennese classical repertoire. As those of us within the field know, I mean, some of the heftiest tomes of music theory, whether it's William Kaplan's Classical Form, which is now 22 years old, but has been reissued 7 or 8 years ago, I think, as a textbook, or Hepikowski and Darcy's 600 plus page Elements of Sonata Theory, or other theorists like Stephen van der Mortele or Nathan Martin. There are a whole lot of people still working to refine ideas, let's say, or some to overturn, that you could just trace a direct line back to Marx with a kind of 20th century caesura in there, when Marxian kind of thinking about musical form got sidelined by the theories of Heinrich Schenker, and then everyone was doing that, which, again, I won't get into it right now, but Schenker's another Jewish music theorist who has had extremely conservative, rabidly nationalistic, pro-German nationalistic politics. And that is a whole interesting story too. But I think starting with Kaplan's work in 1998, there's not a music theory conference that goes by where you don't have a session or two dedicated to classical form. So there is something about this that continues to be attractive. And I would say, how to put this? I don't want to slander or malign anyone, but it seems to me if we can call it, well, I'll put it out there as a kind of thought that if this idea of musical form as a problem arose in the political context of an early German liberalism, it raises the question whether the sort of what has been called the new Formenlehre is in some way aligned with new forms of liberal politics or neoliberalism. I'm not arguing that it is, but I think it raises the interesting question.
We are coming to the end of our time. And if you feel so inclined, you may unmute yourself. I think you can. I don't know if you can.
Oh, I think you have to ask to be unmuted.
Oh, that's right. Hold on.
Well, if while someone is typing or not typing or trying to figure out how to get unmuted, let me just say again how grateful I am. Oh, okay. But how grateful I am to have all of you here listening and and helping me to think through this.
Yeah. Let's see. All right. More people are showing themselves, so we can at least say thank you. And
thanks, Matt.
Great.
You can unmute yourself, everybody.
All right.
So yes, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
And thank all of you. And if anyone has even the slightest inclination to follow up in any way with me, please don't hesitate.